Hi everyone, this is your TA Kyle. I'm going to be filling in for Dr. Cowan today and on Thursday. Next week will be Valeria for Tuesday and Thursday. And then Dr. Cowan will resume his regularly scheduled lectures. Today and Thursday we'll be talking about opioids and pain from chapter 10 in Julian. So today we're going to learn all about opium, which is essentially just dried poppy juice. You can see on the right-hand side the poppy plant, which is sort of bleeding this liquid, which is made up of different opioids like morphine and codeine. We'll look at the history of opioid drug use, going back all the way to ancient Egypt and likely even earlier, through to the present day where we see the rise of much more potent synthetic opioids. We'll look at the brain's endogenous opioid receptors and where they're distributed in the brain, and we'll look at what effect opioids have on neural activity. We'll look at some underlying neural circuitry for pain perception and what effect opioids have on the function of that circuitry and how opioids act to reduce pain. Next time, we'll look at some of the underlying mechanisms behind the function of opioids and why they can be so addictive, and as well as some of the mechanisms of physical dependence and withdrawal. So the brain produces its own endogenous opioids that can bind with the different opioid receptors distributed throughout the central and peripheral nervous systems, as well as the gastrointestinal tract. But we can also introduce an exogenous drug that can bind with the same opioid receptors. So, for example, beta endorphin and morphine are both mu opioid receptor agonists, which is underlying their analgesic effect. Now, opioids can have a number of effects, including analgesia, but it can also depress respiration, so your breathing becomes much more shallow and irregular. For a long time, opioids were prescribed for cough suppression. They can also cause sleepiness and sedation, and they can regulate your bowel movements. They were used as a treatment for diarrhea, and it can induce constipation. So opioids can be divided into different classes. As I mentioned before, opium is made up of different opioids, such as morphine, codeine, and thebaine. Now, these are all naturally occurring narcotics, but they have since been chemically altered to create semi-synthetic narcotics. So, for example, morphine does not easily pass through the blood-brain barrier, but it has been chemically altered to create heroin, which very quickly crosses the barrier, resulting in a faster and more powerful narcotic effect. We also have totally synthetic narcotics, like fentanyl has been in the news lately, um, which is highly lipid soluble, passes the blood-brain barrier, has a powerful narcotic effect, and it also greatly reduces and depresses respiration. Methadone is another synthetic opioid you've probably heard of that is used to manage opioid withdrawal. And then there are the endogenous opioids that are produced naturally in the brain, such as the endorphins, dynorphins, and capillins, and endomorphins. Opioids can have an extremely powerful analgesic effect. They are the best painkillers that we know of, but unfortunately, they can be quite dangerous, especially some of the more recent synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl. On the picture to your right, you can see the lethal dose of heroin versus fentanyl. And it's just a couple milligrams is enough for a lethal dose. Um, these drugs are also very addictive. They typically start with a legal prescription, and once that prescription runs out, people have become hooked. They go on to look for illicit drugs like heroin and fentanyl on the streets. Opioids have been used for a very long time. The first historical evidence goes all the way back to ancient Egypt around 1500 BC, but it probably started even before that. In ancient Greece, opioids were prescribed for a number of conditions, including diarrhea, pain, cough, and sleep disruption. Uh, Laudanum is an opium-laced wine tincture that was used in the Victorian age as a cough suppressant and pain reliever. And in fact, laudanum is still available today by prescription in the United States to ease withdrawal symptoms in infants born to mothers addicted to heroin. We have even fought wars over opium, which we'll discuss. Laudanum, as I mentioned before, is an opium and wine tincture, which has historically been used as a cough suppressant and pain reliever. Um, It was often prescribed to Victorian women to relieve menstrual cramps and aches and pains. And it was also a popular recreational drug. For one reason, it was cheaper than a bottle of wine because it was not taxed as an alcoholic beverage, but rather treated as a medical treatment. However, it has a strong abuse potential. So it was first regulated by the FDA in 1906 to have labels accurately describing the content and dosage of the drugs within the tincture. So here are a couple images of opium dens. Opium dens were prevalent throughout the world in the 19th century. You can see in the picture on the right, the gentleman is holding a long opium pipe, holding it over an oil lamp. That lamp vaporizes the drug and allows the smoker to inhale the vapors. Two wars were fought over opium in the 19th century between Britain and China. Many Chinese were addicted, and the Chinese emperor issued several decrees declaring the opium trade illegal. The main supplier of opium was the East India Trading Company, and they informed China that they really had no choice, that Britain would use force to push opium into China. China responded by creating a naval blockade to prevent any foreign ships from delivering supplies. Britain responded with force, and 3 years later, a treaty was signed forcing China to cede Hong Kong and established 5 different ports where Britain could ship their opium supplies. In 1856, China again started seizing British ships and preventing import of opium. And again, war broke out, and Britain forced China to pay reparations for expenses of the war and legalize the opium trade. So as I mentioned before, heroin is a semi-synthetic opioid, which is a modified version of morphine. The addition of 2 acetyl groups makes the molecule more lipid soluble and thus more easily able to pass the blood-brain barrier. This makes heroin much more potent and powerful than standard morphine. It was invented by a Bayer scientist in the 1890s, where they were looking for a non-addictive alternative to morphine. However, it quickly became a big problem with one of the highest rates of addiction. Several other semi-synthetic opioids have been created from morphine. You can see on the bottom the chemical structure of the different drugs, where just a few small modifications can lead to very different effects. For example, naloxone is a mu-opioid receptor antagonist that can bind with the receptor but not have the same action as morphine or heroin. So opioid abuse is a big problem. Over 40,000 people die every year from opioid overdose in the United States. And that's more Americans that died during the entire Vietnam War. On the chart below, you can see deaths per 100,000 population due to opioids. And you can see that natural and semi-synthetic opioids have been slowly growing consistently over the years, but that in the past few years there's been a precipitous rise in synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Now this graph only goes through 2015, but the problem has continued to grow and surpass the natural and semi-synthetic category. You can also see that the problem is geographically distributed with certain hotspots throughout the United States. So as I mentioned before, fentanyl is much more dangerous than morphine or heroin. It's much more potent and it has a much larger effect on respiration. So a smaller amount is enough for a fatal dose. You can see on the right-hand side what a fatal dose looks like, and it is just a small dusting of fentanyl. Now, drug dealers will often cut heroin with fentanyl without the user's knowledge, making it more potent and more dangerous. As people administer a normal dose of heroin that is unknowingly mixed with fentanyl, they could be delivering a more potent mixture than they realize. Okay, that's it for part one. That's the history of opioids. Now we'll transition and study some of the neurophysiology and the function of opioids in the brain. We'll look at the four major types of opioid receptors and the endogenous opioids, as well as how they change neural function.